Hello, Horror Stories. I decided to share my story with you after a friend mentioned your channel, where many taxi drivers recount their most disturbing and terrifying experiences. I thought it was worth telling you my experience, realizing that I'm not the only one it has happened to. I've heard some of my fellow taxi drivers' stories and felt relieved for a moment, although I would have preferred it hadn't happened to them. It was a Friday in that 2014 in Georgia, United States. My shift was from the afternoon until midnight, and I was returning on Route 75 on what seemed like a quiet night. It was almost midnight. I was returning from the last trip, exhausted, just wanting to get home, have some tea, and chat with my wife, when suddenly I saw a man signaling for a ride. I hesitated to stop because my shift was over, but I reflected for a moment and realized it was too late and dangerous to leave that man waiting for another taxi to pass by in the middle of the night. Therefore, I decided to stop. The man approached the car, and from the first moment, I felt uncomfortable. His appearance was unkempt, and his gaze seemed vacant, as if he were elsewhere. Nonetheless, I reminded myself that it was my duty as a taxi driver to help people in need of transportation, so I asked him where he wanted to go. The man barely murmured a direction, but he seemed distant, as if he were talking to himself. I had a feeling that something was wrong, but I went ahead and started driving in the direction he indicated, even though I realized it was very far and I was tired. I continued anyway. During the journey, the man barely said a word. The silence became increasingly unsettling, and I tried to start a conversation to break the tension, but he barely responded. His behavior gave me goosebumps, and I began to feel very uncomfortable with his presence. As I continued driving down the dark road, the silence between us became more oppressive with each passing minute. I tried to focus on the road, but I couldn't help feeling a growing sense of unease. My instincts told me that something was very wrong. I couldn't ignore my passenger's presence. Suddenly, the man in the back seat began to murmur incomprehensible words in a low and strange tone. His voice blended with the sound of the night, creating an even more unsettling atmosphere. I felt a knot in my stomach as I accelerated the car, wishing to reach our destination as soon as possible and leave behind that unexpected journey on the road. The journey seemed endless. Finally, I spotted the city lights in the distance, and a sigh of relief escaped my lips. However, the relief was short-lived when the man suddenly instructed me to turn right onto a narrow dirt road leading to a dark and terrifying path. My heart sank in my chest as I saw the direction the man was indicating. The dirt road seemed to vanish into endless darkness, with no sign of life or civilization in sight. A sense of profound danger gripped me, but I felt compelled to follow my passenger's instructions, as if I were trapped in a feverish dream from which I couldn't awaken. With trembling hands, I turned the steering wheel to the right and began driving down the narrow path. The darkness was overwhelming, enveloping the car in a dense and ominous shadow. My nerves were on edge as I moved forward slowly, becoming increasingly aware of how vulnerable I was in that unfamiliar place. And suddenly a dull sound echoed through the silence of the night, as if something had struck the car. My heart leaped in my chest as I looked around for the source of the noise, but there was nothing but darkness and silence. The sense of danger intensified, and I realized I had fallen into a deadly trap. I tried to reverse and escape from that accursed place, but the car's wheels sank into the loose mud, trapping me in my prison of darkness. Desperation consumed me as I struggled to free myself, but it was futile. I was completely defenseless, at the mercy of whatever lurked in the darkness. The passenger remained silent. I got out of the taxi to see how the car had gotten stuck, and after several attempts and a rough maneuver, I managed to get it out. Finally, I told the man that I couldn't take him to his destination, that we needed to turn back, but he only responded with a hollow voice, "You're not going to leave me here. Keep going." Despite my growing fear and resistance, I felt as if I were trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't escape. My hands continued to tremble as I turned the steering wheel and continued along the dark path, with my heart pounding in my chest. All I could think about was wanting to get home. The path became narrower and more tortuous, as if we were entering the bowels of the earth itself. The darkness was palpable, enveloping us in its cold and menacing embrace. The silence was so thick that I could hear my own accelerated heartbeat echoing in my ears. Suddenly, something in the distance caught my attention. A flickering faint light could be seen among the dark trees. It was as if it were a beacon in the night, a guide to salvation amidst the overwhelming darkness. Instinctively, I accelerated the car towards the light, feeling a mixture of hope and fear that made me tremble. The passenger in the back seat remained silent, like a mute shadow observing everything happening around him. We continued for a few more long minutes when I turned to address the man and ask him how much longer it was to his destination, as it wasn't a safe route. But inexplicably, he was no longer in the back seat. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the passenger had disappeared. I turned my head in all directions, desperately searching for him in the darkness that surrounded me, but there was no trace of him. How had he disappeared so suddenly? Fear engulfed me as my mind tried to comprehend what had just happened. Was it real or just an illusion? The man's words echoed in my head, filled with a dark foreboding that made me fear the worst. I decided not to waste any more time in that cursed place. I stepped on the accelerator forcefully, ignoring the fear gripping my heart, turned around, and headed back towards Route 75. I couldn't see anything on the road, had no sense of time, and no assurance that I would find the exit quickly. The night seemed to wrap me in its dark cloak as I advanced along the narrow path, with uncertainty and fear as constant companions. I didn't know how much time had passed since that strange man had gotten into my taxi, but every minute that passed plunged me deeper into despair. Suddenly, a flash of light illuminated the path ahead of me, breaking the oppressive darkness surrounding me. I blinked in surprise, wondering if it was real or just another trick of my tormented mind. But as I moved forward, the light became brighter and more defined, revealing an exit among the trees that opened onto a clearing bathed in moonlight. I looked back one last time, but the narrow path and the threatening darkness had vanished, as if they had never existed. I felt as if I had awoken from a bad dream, with relief and gratitude filling my heart. With a sigh of relief, I headed back to Route 75, feeling a sense of liberation as I saw the city lights in the distance. I had escaped from that nightmare alive, and I was determined not to fall into the clutches of darkness again. As I drove back home, a question kept echoing in my mind. What had that mysterious passenger been, and what had truly happened on that dark and endless road? As I resumed the journey home, I tried to call my wife, but my phone had run out of battery, and inexplicably the taxi's radio wasn't working either. Everything remained silent, but the only thing that encouraged me was that I was getting closer to home. When I arrived home, my wife was sitting on the couch with the remote control in her hand, watching the news. Her face was pale, and with a tone of concern, she asked if I was okay, and why I had been so delayed and hadn't answered her calls. It was at that moment that I asked her to warm me up a cup of tea, and I sat down to tell her everything. My wife listened attentively as I recounted every detail of my encounter with the mysterious passenger and the terrifying experience on the dark road. Her face reflected a mixture of astonishment, concern, and relief as she listened to my story. When I finished speaking, her eyes widened even more, and her hand trembled slightly as she held the teacup. I must say I was very scared. I decided to return to work as a taxi driver after a few days off, although I still felt the weight of the experience on that dark road. My wife supported me in my decision, but I could see the worry in her eyes as I bid her goodbye to start my shift. That night, as I drove through the illuminated streets of the city, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, fearing to find the mysterious passenger again in my back seat. Every shadow, every sudden noise made me nervous, but I tried to stay calm and focus on my job. As I turned on the radio to distract myself from all evil, they were announcing the disappearance of a taxi driver who hadn't returned from his shift 2 days ago. They had identified his car in the same place where I had driven that day with that strange passenger. I was petrified, unable to believe what I had just heard. Could that mysterious passenger have something to do with the disappearance of the other taxi driver? Shivers ran down my spine as my mind filled with horrible thoughts. I decided to head home as quickly as possible, feeling a sudden urgency to get away from that place and seek safety with my wife. Every shadow on the road seemed to threaten to conceal some unknown danger, and my heart pounded hard in my chest as I accelerated the car. When I finally arrived home, I found my wife waiting for me with a look of relief on her face. She hugged me tightly, feeling the comfort of her arms around me. I told her what I had heard on the radio, and together we tried to find a logical explanation for what was happening. We spent the night awake, unable to shake the image of the mysterious passenger, and the disappearance of the other taxi driver from our minds. Every sound outside the window made us jump nervously, and we clung to each other for comfort and protection. The next day, I decided to contact the authorities and tell them about my experience. I provided them with all the details I could remember, hoping they could find some clues about what had really happened that night on the dark road. Weeks passed without any news, and anguish and fear continued to haunt us at every moment. Every time I went out to work, I found myself nervously looking around, fearing to encounter again that mysterious passenger who had brought terror into my life. Eventually, the authorities had stopped searching. That taxi driver had left no trace and had plunged into mystery. Despite everything, I tried to move on with my life, but the memory of that night continued to torment me at every moment. Months passed, and a new piece of news flooded the headlines. In the area where the taxi driver had disappeared and where I had been immersed in terror that night, just minutes from Route 75, they had found hidden satanic rituals in the nearby forest. Authorities were investigating the case, but details were scarce, and the truth seemed shrouded in an even darker mystery. I decided to speak with the authorities again, providing all the information I had about my encounter with the passenger and the strange direction he had given me. Perhaps this could shed some light on the case of the satanic rituals and help the authorities solve the mystery of the taxi driver's disappearance. Finally, after weeks of agonizing waiting, I received a call from the authorities. They had found evidence suggesting a possible connection between the mysterious passenger and the satanic rituals in the forest. Although the details were vague, I felt a momentary relief knowing that my experience had not been in vain and that perhaps it could help solve the case. But to this day, that strange man has never been identified, and the missing taxi driver has never been found. They believe it was a paranormal event, but the authorities cannot admit such a fact. Today I continue working with my taxi, but I only drive during the day shift, and I have to say I am very relieved because I will retire soon. I will never be able to forget what I have lived through. Fear has become a constant shadow that will follow me wherever I go.